So that draws the presentations to a close. We're a little bit behind the schedule, but not too much, so thank you very much to all of you for being so brief. That means we now have time for questions from the audience, and I've just looked in Slido. There are a couple of questions in Slido so far, so if you wish to pose your questions on Slido, you're more than welcome to do so. But likewise, I will just ask at the moment, is there anyone in the audience who would like to pose a question, either a general question or one directed to a specific project? The floor is yours if you wish to ask a question here in the audience. I don't immediately see a question in the audience, so I'll use the Slido questions instead. So a question at the top, question to the sharing and super projects. You emphasize how your projects are relevant to policymakers, but can you communicate your conclusions to policymakers? Do you know how you will do this? So if there is a mic on each table, so either David or Listen, if you can have a go at that one, I would be grateful.
Okay, should I kick it off?
Yeah.
Well, that came at the very end of my presentation quite quickly, so it's not surprising there's a question about this. We are going to do those case studies, and we're really going to dig in deep about what works and what doesn't work. We're also looking at interventions throughout Europe and trying to assess what works and what doesn't work. We're going to compile a handbook about best practices, but also practices that don't work very well. So we're going to try to show guidelines when you're trying to steer urban development and show what works in certain situations and what doesn't. So that is one way, the handbook. Another is outreach. As I said, 2 of our project members are ECPs, and one is also involved with the urban partnerships. So we're going to just use our own networks to promote our own project and get the message out there.
Okay, excellent. Do you want to say something in addition? Listen.
Yes.
It's on. It's good. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think for our project, there are 3 main ways. So the first one would be this handbook that we will provide at the end of the project, where we will give practical recommendations for policymakers based on the practices we identify in the territories we focus on. We also organize workshops in the territories where we invite policymakers and we make them speak with the initiatives. And the third way is also outreach, which in our case is helped by one member of the consortium, which is the Sharing Cities Alliance. So there are a network of cities that are interested in the sharing economy. And so we are partnering with them and the organization which is behind it, so we can also disseminate the results of the study during these events.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to take another question which has been highly ranked up on Slido in the last couple of minutes. So this is a question to Thijs. ACPA focuses on 8 large cities that are probably relatively well prepared to deal with an aging population. Are we not ignoring the real problem, an aging population in shrinking rural regions? Behind that, I may also then say maybe actually it's just a question that how the project was designed in the first place. So if you can, to a certain extent, have a go at answering that one, I'd be grateful.
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's a very relevant question. It's also something that has been discussed during the project. First of all, I think it's important to tell a little bit about the cities that are involved. There's the assumption here that they are all large cities. It's not entirely the case. Hengelo, for example, has around 80,000 inhabitants, so that's not a very large city. But still, there's different levels of development for aging policies in these cities in general. There are cities that are more involved and that have been doing this for a longer period of time and also have more tools to really assess or address these issues. And there are cities that are really in the starting phase. I would believe that indeed aging populations in shrinking rural regions. For those regions, it's maybe a bit more difficult to gather proper resources. But in our study, we're trying to also incorporate different styles of governance in our good practices that we gather, so that also for these types of regions, there should be some outputs that are useful for more rural typologies.
Okay, thank you very much. And then there's one more that's just come in, so I'm going to... oh, go for it. Yeah, sure.
Thank you for the question, and this gives a brilliant opportunity. Actually, the rural area are not in the scope of this project, but of course this is a need in Europe. So really I invite whatever stakeholder facing with this challenging situation to apply for an ESPON targeted analysis. To think about that, to try to create a consortium, and then to apply for an ESPON targeted analysis. So together we can find answers also to this important question. Thank you.
Okay, right. One more that's come in is the question that's second on the slide there. So this is a question for Petri. Escape project will also address will it also address how the common agricultural policy or the EU's cohesion policy are supporting or not rural shrinking areas?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, first of all, answer to the second part, so the cohesion policy. I think that I would not be here if we had not underlined in the cohesion policies. So, of course, we will underline the cohesion policies in relation to the shrinking rural regions. And then, naturally, we can't avoid the CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, because that is one important economic sector in the rural areas. But I want to underline that is the other side of the coin, the economic side of the coin. And in many rural areas, actually, agricultural, farmers and agricultural-related economies, they are only about 5 to 20% of the employment. So it differs a lot as well. But certainly we are underlining that. I don't know how deep dive we will take actually to the common agricultural policy. Not too deep, because if we do that, you will never come back from the common agricultural policies. But of course we will have discussions with our stakeholders also relating to the rural issues. And we will cover all the cohesion programs, rural program, and also the ERDF and also the ESF, because they are also operational in the rural areas. And just short, the shrinking rural areas, aging in the rural areas. Of course, that is also a very difficult problem in many rural areas. But again, not always a major problem. There are so different rural areas as well, and that's why in the 8 case studies we will underline different issues. But I just want to say that aging is not solely a rural problem. It's also an urban problem.
All right, thank you very much. Before I come back to some more Slido questions, again, the floor is open. Would anyone else like to pose a question or make a comment from the audience here? Or are you all only posing questions on Slido by now? Nothing, I still see nothing from the audience, so we'll come to the next questions on Slido. So the escape project, the one highlighted in blue, we've answered already. The second question there, what are the factors that can be considered when looking at the impact of urbanization? I don't know exactly which project that second one would be addressed to. I assume that it might be the super project. Is that correct? So could you have a go at that one if you wouldn't mind, David?
Yeah, this is tough because what could be considered almost anything could be considered. So right now what we're doing with our strategy of data collection is to cast the net as wide as possible, and we're trying to find factors either through the literature or by asking people. And so we're right now making a list of interventions, and we're trying to find at least a few interventions in each member state which change urbanization and land use. But that's the strategy we're adopting right now.
Okay. There's another one for you at the bottom there, for this, while you have the microphone in your hand. Will the project also look at the anomalies of some shrinking cities that face population decline, but at the same time expand and generate sprawl?
Oh yeah, that's a very interesting one. First of all, we don't like to call it sprawl, because that's also very difficult to operationalize and has a pejorative aspect to it. So you do have shrinking cities in terms of population where you see still more conversion of rural to urban land. And those are very interesting spaces, because you're thinking, why is that happening, and where is that happening? So yes, definitely that's going to be, I think, an interesting zooming in on our developments of Europe.
Right, I'm next going to take the one that's second on the screen at the moment, so for quality of life. So this is for you, Carlo. Can you explain the factfulness approach and why it is important to consider in this project? Yeah, it's on. It's good. It's good. Now it's off. Okay. Now it's good. It's good. Light off. Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's the contrary.
Yeah. Go for
It's
it.
a proper perception. The factful approach. Actually, the factful approach comes from Hans Rosling, was applied at the global level using a World Bank database about indicators which were also classified according to level of income of countries. So the basis was comparing all the nations in the world. And what this approach showed on that data was that we have a number of instincts into looking at data, time series data, which really distort the way, bias the way in which we immediately understand what those indicators means. And this is not, that is a matter that depends from the fact that we have a number of stereotypes in our mind which are connected to the kind of silos knowledge that any one of us necessarily has, experts or non-experts. So you concern the experts, concern the citizens. And Rosling was using a test asking people about global phenomena, if we were better or worse than in the past today. And usually, he said there is the chimpanzee rule. The chimpanzee will answer better than human beings about phenomena, about, for example, the education level of the population at global level, these kind of things. So we thought very interesting to use this approach at the local level. And regional local level, what we would like to explore, if there is a database that can help us to design, to think and to design a factfulness test for this kind of more local data. Why it is important? Because with the quality of life. It's not a matter of subjective versus objective quality of life. For the subjective quality of life, you have surveys and you ask people how they feel themselves. It's a matter about real facts, real data that you can measure with indicators and trends in a place, so in a territory, how they are going, if they are going up or going down, how they are perceived by the people, by the policymaker, by the experts. Because quality of life is inherently multidisciplinary. It's not one thing. There are many, many aspects. People cannot know all the aspects of the life. So the people think that, for example, migrants in your place are so many. And then you look at some data, you can see that the migrants are not increasing at all, for example. No? So we want to use this factfulness test approach for testing its efficacy into a policy cycle in which the quality of life measurement are used for communicating with the people and improving the interpretation and the understanding of what the real situation is.
Okay, thank you very much. Then I'm going to take this one that's now second, been highly ranked up in the last couple of minutes. how can technological transformation help reduce inequalities? Roberta, that's one for you. A rather large and complicated question to answer, I fear.
I will try to be
please have a
brief.
go.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, the project will try to see whether this is true, whether technological transformation brings to an inequality pattern. But there are at least already two ways that we foresaw during the studies that we have done so far. One is that given the characteristics of these technologies and the way in which they are created, they don't really need large laboratories, and they are, let's say, most of them are recombinations of already existing technologies, which means that in regions that were absolutely not technologically oriented are now able to become creative regions. So there are what we call, and we will call it in the interim report, new islands of innovation in Europe that were not there before. The second way is on the side of the, let's say, adoption. There are services that are offered, digital service that are offered in a very broad way, and there are inner areas or peripheral areas that can exploit services that were otherwise not there. For example, travel agencies for renting houses in very remote but very nice touristic areas. Now they can really become get a boom of that thanks to Airbnb. All these types of services that allow the visibility of these remote areas but whether this will bring, because these are the advantages for remote areas, but for sure also the central areas will. So inequality means that if you reduce inequalities means that the central areas would get less advantage than the remote ones, and this has to be proved.
Okay, that also deals with the question that's just come in right at the very bottom, which is more or less the same question. That's fair enough, I think. So I'm going to take one final one because then we're running out of time. I think this one was partly answered in Xavier's presentation, but a question for ACPA and Ensure. The problems both of these projects address are not new. What is going to be new about how you're addressing the issues? But I think you answered that with the typology of the cities, at least would be my interpretation. But if you want to add, both of you, a little bit more on that, kind of the problems of regeneration of port cities, we know. What's different about the way you're doing it?
Yes, the problem is known, but the solutions aren't. So maybe that's what the project can bring as added value. I mean, interestingly enough, this project I think was triggered by the city of Cork, which has a huge regeneration project ahead of them. It's been pending for, I think, 20 years because they've been facing a lot of challenges, which I won't go into details now, but which I believe we can actually address by looking into other stakeholders' cities' practices, but also a little bit beyond. The project is resolutely, I would say, empirical. We're really looking into the process from vision to realization, and look into the different policy framework, governance framework, but also planning strategies actually to realize a complex regeneration process which involves cities and port authorities, cities and port functions. And actually, we also want to reconsider the relationship between these two, I would say, entities, which, as I said before, used to be very closely interrelated and have been lost a bit this interrelation. So I think this is what really the project is aiming for, is to look at these issues that are indeed well known, and try to the best extent we can, of course, to bring solutions.
Okay, thank you. Thijs, do you want to have a go at that for yours?
First of all, I fully agree with what that's just been said. Yeah, problem is not new. It's been known for a long time that this is going to happen, is happening right now. But what we are trying to do with our research is to really focus on the ways that cities have already tried to solve this issue. We also really see that there's still lots of questions being asked. The governments are uncertain about how they can help the older generations and the aging. And by really taking a look at, firstly, the strategic level on a more broader scale for the cities, we take on a more broader scale, we try to really get the general message across, and then on a more specific scale for domains, we try to translate that message into actual useful, practical recommendations that can be applied in different cities as well. So it's really about the translation from your general policy message to actual projects, actual ideas that can help with the aging process.
Right, because we're now out of time, there's still one or two other questions there, but maybe those of you that pose the extra questions can address those to our experts in the margins or over dinner this evening. So thank you to all of you, and thank you to the ESPON team as well, so they deserve a warm round of applause for how much they've covered in the last hour and a bit. So thank you very much indeed to all of you.